Last class, we covered the home front and the end of the war in Europe. Today, we are going to cover the end of the war in Japan, which means the end of the war at large. All right, so the last time we talked about the Pacific front of World War II was when we talked about Pearl Harbor. So remember, Pearl Harbor is what completely changed the American opinion about whether or not we should go to war. And right after Pearl Harbor, the U.S. immediately declared war on Japan the very next day, and we started to deploy troops to the Pacific. And also remember, with Pearl Harbor, they also destroyed our entire Pacific fleet. So in addition to building up an army, we also had to begin rebuilding our Pacific fleet. And we did so immediately with millions of people working in factories, especially women and minorities, to help build up our Pacific fleet. And FDR also expanded the Navy and the Marine Corps in order to get the job done in the Pacific. So after months of fighting, including the Battle of Coral Sea, one of the first major battles, the Battle of Midway occurred. And this was the big turning point of the war in the Pacific. Afterwards, the war in the Pacific still lasted a very long time, but we were always kind of winning throughout the rest of the war in the Pacific. All right, now the Battle of Midway, this is when the U.S. intercepted a Japanese message that said that the Japanese would attack the Pacific island of Midway, a U.S. territory, still a U.S. territory today, and it's pretty much right in between the U.S. West Coast and Japan. And the telegram said that the Japanese would attack there. Therefore, the U.S., when we intercepted it, we knew exactly where they would attack, and we caught them by surprise instead of they catching us by surprise. All right, so we were ready for them when they arrived, and through this battle, which was mostly in the air and on sea, the U.S. was able to destroy 4 Japanese aircraft carriers. 4 Japanese aircraft carriers. Aircraft carriers are massive, and usually a country does not have more than a handful of them. And to be able to destroy 4 in just one battle, that is a huge victory. Okay, so this completely crippled the Japanese Navy, and they never fully recovered after Midway. They were able to build up a little bit more after that, but never got to the point that they were the day before the Battle of Midway, right? So after that, it was really just a matter of time before we won. But remember, one reason why it lasted so long is because the Japanese refused to ever surrender. They would literally fight to the last man on every single island. So after the Battle of Midway, we continued our strategy of island hopping. Went from island to island, fought the Japanese, had to kill pretty much every single one who was on the islands as we got closer and closer to the Japanese mainland. Now, in August of 1942, the Americans and Japanese began to fight the Battle of Guadalcanal. This was one of the biggest battles in the Pacific theater in World War II, and this battle lasted 6 months. So with World War II, you have battles lasting a very long time. With World War I, you had battles lasting a long time too because of trench warfare. In World War II, they do not have trench warfare like they did in World War I, but you have different tactics, different type of fighting like you do with the Japanese who would never surrender, and also like with the Russians and the Germans who refused to surrender at Stalingrad, which is why it lasted so many months too. So you still have long battles in World War II, but not because of trench warfare. And during this lengthy battle, the U.S. Marine Corps invaded the island of Guadalcanal, which Japan had previously taken over, and the U.S. was able to fight the Japanese out of this island. So tens of thousands of soldiers died on this island, some Japanese, some American, and afterwards the Japanese called this place the Island of Death, because literally every single one of them died on that island because they refused to surrender until their very last person was killed. As MacArthur, Douglas MacArthur, who was leading the Marines, as MacArthur and the Marines kept island hopping one island to the next, you have Lieutenant Jimmy Doolittle, who carried out several bombings of Tokyo and other Japanese cities. All right, so there was an air campaign going on over the Japanese mainland at the same time as we were island hopping, getting closer and closer to Japan itself. The Battle of Iwo Jima took place close to the end of the war. There were a lot of different battles between Guadalcanal and Iwo Jima, but Iwo Jima was one of the biggest battles of the war. Okay, this is where you get this very famous picture that became a statue. You see this is in Washington, D.C., and there's a replica of this statue as well in Quantico, Virginia at the Marine base. All right, one of the most famous pictures of the 20th century. And Iwo Jima was a Pacific island fairly close to the Japanese mainland. And this was one of the bloodiest battles of the entire war. 18,000 Japanese were killed, 7,000 American soldiers were killed. Now, just a little perspective here. 7,000 American soldiers were killed in the entire Iraq War, plus the entire Afghanistan War combined. All right, so you have years of fighting that produced the same number of American casualties as this one battle of Iwo Jima. And this was not even the worst for us. We'll get to that one in a second. But this was a very significant U.S. victory, and it was made famous by this picture, really made the Marine Corps kind of some of the heroes of the American military. From Iwo Jima, since the Allies were getting so close, the next island to invade was Okinawa. Okay, this is an island very close to Japan, as you see in the map there, pretty much right off the coast. You see we're getting so close to the Japanese mainland, been island hopping for years, and finally we get to Okinawa. Now, Okinawa was the bloodiest battle of the Pacific Theater. In this entire half of the war, the most people were killed in the Battle of Okinawa. 12,000 Americans were killed, 77,000 Japanese soldiers were killed, and over 100,000 Japanese civilians were killed. Whenever you have that number of civilian deaths, it's just heartbreaking. But you can probably understand why there were so many. Since you're on an island, if a fight breaks out, if a battle breaks out on your island, there's really nowhere to go, no way to escape. Also, the Japanese would sometimes use their own civilians in the fighting. Like they would strap bombs to a civilian and send her or the child into the Americans. Okay, so the Americans would have to shoot her, but then the bombs would go off and kill Americans as well. And just nasty tactics used by the Japanese here. Big reason why Okinawa was the bloodiest, most devastating battle of the war in the Pacific. The Allies did win, and in fact, the U.S. occupied Okinawa all the way up until 1972, and then it became its own independent nation. Now, Japan also used kamikaze attacks. You probably heard that term before, maybe. And kamikaze, that is when they would fly a plane into a building or into a ship while they were still in it. It was a suicide mission, suicide bomber. And the use of kamikaze pilots, in addition to all the other horrible tactics that the Japanese used, really showed about the Japanese culture that they valued honor more than they valued individual life. Did not have that much of a value for individual human life, and would literally fight to the last man in a lot of battles. In fact, whenever they would die on a battlefield, a lot of times they would take a grenade, if they had one, pull the pin, and then lay down on top of it to die. That way, after the battle, when Americans were coming around and kind of kicking over bodies to make sure people were dead, whenever they would kick over that body, the grenade would explode and kill the American soldier, so that Japanese people could even kill after they had died. Okay, so those types of tactics were used quite a bit by the Japanese, which is something Americans had never dealt with before. And throughout these years of fighting, both in the Pacific and in Europe, American scientists were working on something called the Manhattan Project. Manhattan Project, very important project here, really completely changed the world. And this was the project that developed the atomic bomb, the first ever nuclear weapon. And it was led by a man named J. Robert Oppenheimer, who you see in the top photo there. Okay, the way an atomic bomb works is that you split an atom. That's why it's called an atomic bomb, an atom bomb. You split an atom or the nucleus of that atom, which is why it's called a nuclear weapon. And through splitting that atom, you create so much energy that you can literally destroy an entire city with that explosion. Never before had we come even close to having a weapon of this scale in human history. So FDR had led us through this entire war, but then right before the war came to a close on April 12th, 1945, FDR died. He died of a stroke at his home in Warm Springs, Georgia. And when he died, his vice president, Harry S. Truman, became president. So Harry S. Truman had only been vice president for a few months, and he had no idea about the Manhattan Project. There were like less than 100 people in the entire country who knew about the Manhattan Project. FDR knew about it. Maybe one or two of his close advisors did, and then the scientists did. Not even the vice president knew about this. It was so secretive, they wanted to completely keep it under wraps. All right, but then in April, they successfully detonated the first atomic bomb in the desert, so it didn't hurt anybody, and found out that we had this technology that could potentially end the war. So Truman had this very difficult decision to make. Should we use the atomic bomb or not? It's a very difficult decision because he knew that dropping an atomic bomb would lead to the immediate deaths of tens of thousands of people. But if we didn't use the bomb, the big question is what then, okay? What's our other option? And what convinced Truman to drop the atomic bomb on Japan was his belief that the only other option would be an all-out invasion of mainland Japan. That this was the only other option, and that this would result in an estimated 100,000 U.S. soldiers dying, not compared with the millions of Japanese who would die in this invasion as well. Okay, so I think Truman reasoned correctly here that this was the only other option and would save more lives in the long run. Also, now that Germany had been defeated, it was now Stalin's goal to defeat Japan before the U.S. does. And this could be very dangerous for the post-war world because if Stalin was the one to get Japan to surrender, then he would control that portion of Asia, that portion of the world, and make it all communist. So Truman said, we need to get an unconditional, absolute surrender from the Japanese, and we need to do it fast before Stalin can. So the bottom line, Japan needs to surrender unconditionally to the U.S. and soon, okay, to prevent the loss of the most human lives and to prevent Russia from taking over Japan. So in August of 1945, the United States dropped an atomic bomb on the city of Hiroshima. 80,000 people died in 1 second. All right, so here on the left here is the explosion that it caused. Okay, it just went so far up in the air. Here is an aerial view of Hiroshima before the bomb, and here it is after the bomb. Absolutely nothing is left. Everything was completely incinerated, dissolved in a matter of seconds. All right, so here, surely, Truman said, all right, there's a very difficult decision. It's tough to make, but at least this will bring the Japanese to surrender. But they didn't, okay? Even though we had warned Japan before we dropped the bomb, they didn't surrender. Even after we dropped the bomb, they still didn't surrender. It took a second atomic bomb. The U.S. dropped a second atomic bomb on the city of Nagasaki 3 days later, and then finally, Japan surrendered only because they thought we had a third one, which we didn't, but thankfully they thought that. And this ended World War II. Okay, now we're going to watch a video that really shows the power that this bomb had and kind of depicts what it was like, and you hear from some survivors of the bomb and the person who actually dropped the bomb from the plane itself. All right, so this is what it took to end the biggest war, bloodiest war, greatest catastrophe really of all time. It took the dropping of 2 atomic bombs. All right, let me know if you have any questions or if I can explain anything further.